So I'm going to talk about these two paintings very quickly. I need to read off of my computer, so I'll turn off the screen sharing in a moment. But this is the first painting that Ueda discusses, the well-stocked kitchen. Jesus is in the back, Mary is worshiping Jesus, and Martha is in the front, busy about domestic affairs. And the second image is of the sixth patriarch cutting bamboo from the 13th century. So just so you have both of those in your minds as I'm talking. So I'll stop sharing now. Okay, heartfelt thanks for the invitation to participate in this workshop. What I'll be presenting today is a revised version of the paper I gave at an earlier workshop on Nishitani's essay, Mysticism. I'm hoping eventually to publish this material as a book chapter on Nishitani's relation to Meister Eckhart generally. Although I'll be unable to address them in detail, 5 topics seem to me to be especially important when trying to understand this relation and ultimately to stage a confrontation about basic ontological, epistemological, and ethical commitments. I think we could also add a 6th topic now after Tobias's presentation and the reply. So I want to think more about that too. The topics that I thought about were 1, the role of God, and 2, Christ in particular. 3, the status of the singular in the old problem of the one and the many. 4, the importance of history for philosophy, above all modern nihilism. And 5, the mode of access to the self-overcoming of nihilism, especially as it concerns the human body. So I want to begin with 2 epigraphs, which are in slight tension with one another and which reflect something of the challenges I found myself facing when examining Nishitani's remarks on Eckhart's. The first epigraph comes from a Zen tale as recounted by Deshimaru. Try to return to the time of your birth, when you could not understand which way was east and which was west, and come tell me about it. The second epigraph comes from Nietzsche's Zarathustra. Die kleinste Kluft ist am letzten zu überbrücken. The narrowest cleft is the last to be bridged. It has been a long-standing question as to whether certain moments in Western mysticism and Eastern Buddhism share an identical experiential core, or whether differences in expression indicate differences in content. So I say certain moments because I'm not really interested in this larger project in trying to define Western mysticism or Eastern Buddhism as such, although we will have occasion to discuss Nishitani's Eckhart-inspired conception of speculative mysticism, as well as his appreciation of Buddhist shunyata or emptiness. To answer this question concerning form versus content, Eckhart's Middle High German sermons have frequently been taken as a prime test case. Indeed, in the Kyoto school, Eckart has been perhaps the most important figure in this endeavor, such that what one thinks of the possibility of an identical mystical experience across cultures depends on how one reads Eckhart's. As discussed in a recent article by Johannes Brachtendorf titled Meister Eckhart zwischen Avignon und Kyoto, the school's founder, Nishida Kitaro, along with D.T. Suzuki, who on a more expansive definition is sometimes said to belong to the Kyoto school, to all appearances considered Eckart to be speaking from the same depths as the great Zen masters. Eckhart's conception of the nothingness of the Godhead, with which the ground or spark of the soul is a sheer, undifferentiated oneness, ein einig ein ungeschieden in Middle High German, is apparently in essence no different from the absolute nothingness of Zen. In what Rainer Schermann has called the maximalist interpretation of the Eckhart-Zen relation, Suzuki writes in his 1957 classic Mysticism, Eastern and Buddhist, quote, "When I first read a little book containing a few of Meister Eckhart's sermons, they impressed me profoundly, for I never expected that any Christian thinker, ancient or modern, could or would cherish such daring thoughts as expressed in these sermons. The ideas expounded there closely approached Buddhist thoughts, so closely indeed that one could stamp them almost definitely as coming out of Buddhist speculations. Eckhart is in perfect accord with the Buddhist doctrine of shunyata when he advances the notion of Godhead as pure nothingness, ein bloßes Nicht. At the other end of the spectrum is the minimalist interpretation offered by the third generation Kyoto school philosopher Ueda Shizuteru, who, like Sherman, was not content with Suzuki's syncretism, but felt it necessary to draw some subtle, indeed irreconcilable on his view, distinctions when advised by his doctoral advisor to undertake a now famous comparative study of Eckhart and Zen Buddhism, and to append it to his 1965 dissertation, Die Gottesgeburt in der Seele und der Durchbruch zur Gottheit. The birth of God in the soul and the breakthrough to the Godhead. Although, writes Ueda, in Meister Eckhart's German language sermons, one repeatedly finds statements which could be valid word-for-word translations from Zen text. Ueda nevertheless argues for the, quote, inseparability of Meister Eckhart's theistically colored mysticism of infinity from its theistic foundation. In fact, to such an extent that similarities become completely meaningless. So that passage, I think, is important. Similarities between them become completely meaningless. Buddhism, in Ueda's estimation, goes further than what Eckhart was trying to do in both his negative and affirmative thrusts. Whereas there are still theological, personal, and substantialist residues in Eckhart's understanding of the divine, where, in short, the nothingness of the Godhead equals pure being as no thing, Buddhist emptiness is atheological, impersonal, and in no sense a substance. This has implications for how one's unity with God is lived out in life. According to Ueda, in Eckhartian releasement, two things, and here I'm referring to the first painting, Jesus is painted small. Jesus is in the background, right? But he's still there. Not so in Zen, where God completely unbecomes in the performance of an everyday activity like cutting bamboo, as Ueda explains in reference to the second painting. Although interestingly, here this word unbecomes is an Eckhartian phrase. So he's using an Eckhartian phrase to describe what's going on in Zen, something that he thinks actually can't be taking place in Eckhart. Now, to turn to the topic of our workshop, where does Nishitani Keiji fit in on the interpretive spectrum of the relation between Eckhart and Zen? Judging solely from his explicit comments on Eckhart in texts available in English, such as Nietzsche's Zarathustra and Meister Eckhart's, 1938, the essay Mysticism, 1956, and especially Religion and Nothingness, 1961, Nishitani would seem to align with the maximalist interpretation offered by Nishida and Suzuki. And I'm curious, if you know of any other passages in Nishitani that are radically different from this, please let me know. I'm focusing on these three texts. I looked at some other texts as well, and I didn't find anything radically different in terms of his reading of Eckhart. So Nishitani's only criticism, if one can even call it a criticism on my reading, is that in the Buddhist standpoint of emptiness, what Eckhart was trying to convey about the identical ground of God and self, quote, comes to light still more clearly, end quote. In other words, there's nothing deficient about Eckhart's doctrine. It is only his mode of expression that lends itself to misunderstanding, presumably owing to its theistic, medieval, and Indo-European linguistic trappings. And I think a lot hinges on whether we understand these as trappings, as a kind of external garb that can be removed. After laying out Nishitani's position on Eckhart in the three aforementioned texts, I want to interrogate whether more distinctions would need to be drawn between Eckhart and Nishitani without, for all that, declaring any similarities to be completely meaningless, as Ueda said of the Eckhart-Zen relation. So, first text, Nishitani's Zarathustra and Meister Eckhart. During a research stay in Freiburg, Germany from 1937 to 1939, Nishitani delivered a German version of his essay, Nietzsche's Zarathustra and Meister Eckhart, in one of Heidegger's classes. Which class is unclear, but it's perhaps worth noting that this was the period of Heidegger's most intensive, increasingly critical engagement with Nietzsche. Although to my knowledge, the German is no longer extant. Nishitani published a Japanese version in 1938 in a Festschrift for Hatano Seiichi, as we heard about yesterday from Silva Cerda. This essay marks a key moment in the evolution of Nishitani's philosophy, as he himself indicated by placing it at the beginning of his collected writings, even before other chronologically antecedent works. It even, interestingly, garnered recognition from Heidegger, who surprisingly found the comparison between Eckhart and Nietzsche apt, despite all the differences that separate the Dominican preacher of releasement and the atheist philosopher of the will to power. In Nietzsche's Zarathustra and Meister Eckart, Nishitani takes note of such differences, for example, between the medieval and the modern, between theism and atheism, but nevertheless contends that with the right perspective, we will be able to identify a common core. At stake for both is what Nishitani calls a radicalization of the dialectical movement of living. This means that life can be properly affirmed only when it is thoroughly negated. The saint whom Zarathustra encounters on his way from the mountaintop to the town has renounced the world, so there's an initial negation. But he falls short in two respects. First, he is, to use Eckhart's term, merely united, vereinet, with God. Yet this is but a union of two. We have this kind of mirroring, this reciprocity in play. He has, in other words, failed to realize his sheer undifferentiated oneness with the primal source. Second, by realize, I mean not only recognize, but also actualize and make explicit in the here and now. I mean that the negation that cut the saint off from the world must itself be negated. There must be a double negation. The saint fails to realize the death of God, who, as a counterpart, as an over against, is no living God. We must, in Eckhart's language, break through this God to the Godhead at its source, just as we must break through the superficial layers of the self to the divine spark that is none other than the Godhead. And Nishitani thinks that Nietzsche is getting something similar when he has Zarathustra say, peak and abyss, they are now merged as one. By means of such double negation, true affirmation of overflowing life in us and in all things becomes possible. In this respect, Nietzsche and Eckhart, quote, stand together in the blazing present moment of living's bottomless depths, end quote. Interestingly, Nishitani will continue to affirm this of Eckhart in subsequent decades, but not of Nietzsche, whom Nishitani ultimately considers to have remained caught in the first negation. So despite what we get in the 1938 text, there's much more reservation in Religion and Nothingness, where Nietzsche is seen as attaining only a standpoint of relative absolute nothingness, not absolute nothingness as such. So I might have expected a more thoroughgoing critique, or actually any critique at all, of Eckhart, and then a kind of affirmation of an ongoing affirmation of Nietzsche, things like the will to power aside, but it's inverted. Nishitani centers his reading of Eckhart on the theme of life, not in the senses of, quote, living completely for the moment and giving oneself up to reckless self-abandonment, nor of normal life, which is unified by some consistent reason it grasps within itself, end quote, nor we could say life in terms of mere biology, but rather in the dialectical movement of negation and affirmation I have been outlining. Nishitani explains further, quote, life is both first and last. We cannot establish a limit on life, for life manifests precisely in surmounting its limits. Likewise, there is no reason that could give meaning to life. Life is reasonless. Life will ascend to the highest realms to live out any reason posited therein. Life will then render itself reasonless. Such an elemental nature of life runs throughout Eckhart's thoughts, end quote. While not uncontroversial, we could talk about why this reading of Eckhart's as centered on life is interesting and provocative in comparison to other readings. While not uncontroversial, I take this to be a valuable interpretation of Eckart, one that is best supported by passages such as the following, neither of which Nishitani cites directly, though the first of which I think he's clearly paraphrasing in the text. So here's the first quotation that supports this emphasis on life. It comes from Eckhart's sermon In Hoc Apparuit, number 5b in the critical edition. In translation, if a man asked life for 1,000 years, why do you live? If it could answer, it would only say, I live because I live. That is because life lives from out of its own ground and gushes forth from its own. Therefore, it lives without why, because it lives for itself. And here I take Nishitani to be paraphrasing the quote here when he writes, life lives in order to live, life lives from its ground, it lives without a why, and it lives itself. Or as Eckart puts it in his Latin commentary on John, hoc enim proprie vivit quod est sine principio, only what is without principle lives properly. Although there is no direct discussion of Buddhism in Nietzsche, Zarathustra, and Meister Eckhart, Nishitani's essay lays the groundwork for how he will read Eckhart in subsequent texts. And it is perhaps worth noting that Zen was surely on his mind when composing it. And I say this because while studying in Freiburg, Nishitani gave Heidegger the first volume of Suzuki's Essays in Zen Buddhism, which contains frequent references to Eckhart, by the way. Heidegger had read this text already and wanted to meet with Nishitani to discuss it. This led to further meetings in which they would talk about Zen Buddhism. So Nishitani was thinking about it at the time he was composing this text. Nishitani believed that Heidegger gleaned much from these exchanges and would even silently incorporate them into his lectures, disavowing the Zen influence. Okay, second text, Mysticism from 1956, this typology of mysticism that some of us discussed at the workshop. I think it was about a year ago. Nishitani invokes Eckhart as a chief representative of speculative mysticism in contrast to more moderate personalist mysticism of faith, in contrast to what one might call pietism. What's interesting, I find, about this, he does refer to Eckhart, but what I find interesting about his definition of speculative mysticism is that he's clearly drawing on Eckhartian tropes. He says that this speculative mysticism demands that the self become nothing, that it die to itself, so drawing on the Mors Mystica tradition, the mystical death tradition, and separate from itself, so here a reference to Abgeschiedenheit, so as to break through, durchbrechen, the hidden center of God, that is, to the nothing of the Godhead, where there is not two, but one. So this speculative mysticism demands, in short, and again, more quotes, detachment for the sake of living unity. So here we can see the connection back to the 1938 text. However, in contrast to his earlier essay, Nietzsche's Zarathustra and Meister Eckhart, Nishitani also begins to make explicit the parallels between Buddhism and this Eckhartian version of speculative mysticism. For example, Nishitani explains that entering into the Godhead, this Eckhartian trope, was called becoming God, theosis, a less specifically Eckhartian trope. And then he adds, interestingly, this corresponds in Buddhism to becoming Buddha. The third text I want to discuss is Religion and Nothingness, where Nishitani's view of the overlap between the Eckhartian Godhead and emptiness becomes manifest, although he does express one reservation. In the third chapter of Religion and Nothingness, Nishitani delineates three experiential fields: that of natural consciousness, or life in quotation marks, the nullification thereof, or death, in the field of nihility, and three, the surpassing of the field of nihility in that of emptiness, or death sive life. The move from 2 to 3, which can also be understood as a move beyond nihilism by way of nihilism, is most important. Writes Nishitani, quote, in contrast to the field of nihility, number 2, on which the desolate and bottomless abyss distances even the most intimate of persons or things from one another. On the field of emptiness, number 3, that absolute breach, points directly to a most intimate encounter with everything that exists. End quote. In other words, it marks a re-engagement with the world and an appreciation for each singular thing of experience. In the second chapter, Nishitani had already summarized what he finds so important in Eckhart, that is, what in Eckhart merits, quote, serious reconsideration. Quote, the originality of Eckhart's thinking strikes us on a number of counts. First, he locates the essence of God at a point beyond the personal God who stands over against created beings. Second, this essence of God or Godhead is seen as an absolute nothingness. Here we have a move from field 1 to field 2, and moreover becomes the field of our absolute death, sive life, the move from field 2 to field 3, end quote. Realization of union with the Godhead, maybe I should say with one's oneness, one's already operative implicit oneness with the Godhead, which for Eckhart is not an entitative accomplishment, but an awareness and making explicit of this oneness that already lies at the ground of the soul and God. So this realization, this appropriation, this making our own of this abyssal oneness is for Eckhart ultimately this worldly. That is, as Nishitani writes, it is to be lived right in the midst of everyday life. Unlike Ueda, Nishitani thinks that with Eckhart, we indeed have, quote, absolute negation passing over into absolute affirmation, end quote. His reservation is not then about content, but about form or matter of expression. Quote, the detachment that Eckart spoke of as a radical departure, not only from self and world, but even from God, must rest, as it were, in an absolutely transcendent near side. In the Buddhist standpoint of shunyata, emptiness, this point comes to light still more clearly. The smallest cleft, as Nietzsche said, may be the last to be bridged, and it may well be the hardest. But Eckart manages, if only in his most extreme moments, to join the Godhead with Buddhist emptiness. Or rather, to change the image slightly, the Godhead and emptiness do not need to be bridged, as they are simply different names for the empty cleft itself. From his high vantage point, Eckart didn't, as it were, look across to distant peaks. He looked down into the depths of the valley, the self-same depths of Zen, the self-same valley into which Nishitani looked 7 centuries later. In conclusion, I want to develop, albeit very briefly, the 5 issues I mentioned earlier. The first concerns the centrality of God in Eckhart. It would not be difficult to show that at Eckhart's most radical moments, the trace of the theistic, substantialist, personalist God seems to be blown away by the arid winds of the desert of the Godhead. To this limited extent, Nishitani is right to find in Eckart a fellow traveler on the way to emptiness, absolute nothingness, and death, sive life. Now, one could, of course, ask whether this was Eckhart's intention. I don't think it was, but I don't think that's what's most important here either. More important, I think, is to ask whether this is the last word in Eckhart's. If taken literally, God is not central, as God is to be abandoned for the sake of the Godhead. But Godhead, for all its radicality, still indexes God and hence a certain theism. Is this, in Ueda's words, theistically colored mysticism therefore inseparable from its theistic foundation? Yes and no, I think. No, insofar as the foundation, or better abyss, is not theistic, but rather infra or hypotheistic. Not God, but rather Godhead. Yes, insofar as Eckhart sees the Trinity and Trinitarian structure of creation as a necessary welling up, bullitio, and gushing forth, ebullitio, of the Godhead. The relation of Godhead to God is not one of essence and accidents, as Nishitani might lead us to believe. Rather, it should be understood in a more dialectical fashion, as Nishitani himself will do with respect to the Godhead vis-a-vis ideas and sensual things, already in the 1938 essay. Number 2, the second issue concerns Christ specifically. To be sure, Eckhart shows little concern for the incarnation as a historical occurrence whose recounting would be necessary for salvation. Indeed, Eckhart may be one of the least historically minded thinkers of the Middle Ages. But as I suggested above regarding the Trinity, the imitatio Christi, however keyed in on a seemingly perennialist kenosis and active charity, cannot so easily be separated from the teaching and preaching of the Meister. 3. Given Eckhart's disregard for history, one might also wonder whether he could really have gone as far or even further than Nietzsche. Although in 1938, Nishitani saw Eckart and Nietzsche as speaking from the same depths, and although Eckart did think in a time of unrest after the death of St. Thomas, had Eckart sufficiently suffered the vacuity of existence, tarried with the negative, to allow nihilism to overcome itself? Indeed, one might wonder whether nihilism is an appropriate designation for the High Middle Ages at all. Given this concern, it is all the more surprising that Nietzsche in Religion and Nothingness is seen as deficient, not Eckhart's. The fourth issue concerns practice versus what one might pejoratively call intellectualism. Detachment is not merely an intellectual exercise for Eckart, even though he is in many respects a speculative mystic, using, as it were, the concept to transcend the concept. But is this exercise of detachment compatible with, for example, the focus on sitting, such that either would suffice for the experience of the Godhead or emptiness? Is one superior to the other? And if so, is this superiority unqualified, or might it change depending on one's background? The body plays little positive role in Eckhart's teaching. It is noteworthy that the one Eckhartian passage Nishitani adduces on page 213 of the 1938 text in support of his interpretation of obtaining highest reality in bodily activity is actually spurious. So I think it would be worth looking at all of the texts that Nishitani is drawing on. Many of them are no longer considered authentic, which I think is of interest because he's looking at some of the most radical texts in Eckhart's. It is also noteworthy that this passage talks of free will, another topic that's of little concern to Eckhart's. Last issue. We should ask about the place of the singular in releasement to the world for Eckhart's, or in the field of emptiness for Nishitani. Although there is doubtless an affirmative moment in Eckhart's, a wandering this worldly joy, I don't read Eckhart ultimately as affirming things in their singularity. Eckhart says instead that we should detach from singularity so that all things can become pure God to us. This contrasts, I think, with the emphasis on the thisness of the flower in Nishitani's interpretation of a basho haiku in the essay Mysticism, or even more so with the one cited in chapter 4 of Religion and Nothingness, from the pine tree, learn of the pine tree, and from the bamboo of the bamboo. For Eckart, the imperative is rather to let the tree become God to you, or to see God in all things. Nishitani nevertheless offers an interesting alternative in Nietzsche's Zarathustra and Meister Eckhart when he is explaining how Eckhart overcomes both Platonic Augustinianism and Aristotelian Thomism. Quote, pure acting must transcend even the being of God, and from there turn back home to ideas, and then back to the being of sensual things. Even if the ideas are true reality, or rather because they are true reality, from the standpoint of pure activity that transcends being, they are shapes formed on emptiness, shadows drawn on emptiness, and here this is key, and yet are nevertheless truly real just as so. Even if sensual things, as the shadows of ideas, are thereby the transient shadows of shadows, they are concrete reality that transcends mere shapes and are, in a different sense, true reality. By transcending Platonism and Aristotelianism, there may here be a path toward vitalizing them, end quote. There may also, I would add in conclusion, be a path here toward further vitalizing Eckhart, and hence a path toward bringing him closer to Zen. Nishitani is, in my view, crucial in this regard, even if he is too quick to situate Eckhart on his own path. I look forward to discussing these issues with you, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Moore. A very inspiring talk. So, questions or comments? And so, Soda, please.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. This is quite helpful. I liked this, yeah, critical examination of Ueda's claims and yeah, the comparison to how Nietzsche himself would try to situate Zen and Eckhart. And one thing that yeah, came to mind to me when you mentioned that Eckhart seems to be one of the least historically minded figures at this time was the criticism that Nishitani made of the mystical attitude in the 1937 Shukyo Rekishi Bunka, so the essay, Religion, History, and Culture. And in there, the fault that he makes of the mystical attitude is precisely that it's ahistorical and that it lacks this historical consciousness. And then what makes that interesting then again is that in the self-overcoming of nihilism, the nihilism in the post-war period, the key point that he sees in the development after Hegel, and here I'll quote from the translation, for later modern Europeans, the problem of how to live came to be fused with the problem of how to interpret European history. The point at which the two questions converged became the historical existential standpoint. The eternal inquiry into what it means to be a self was transfigured into an inquiry into historical actuality, and existence became fundamentally historical. And such was the state of affairs that came to light in nihilism, whose standpoint is philosophical, not in spite of its being entirely historical, but because of it. So the crucial insight that he sees with Nietzsche as its culmination is this, yeah, this hyper sensitivity to the issue of history in existence and life. Now, like you said, it's interesting here because then if you contrast the mystical attitudes, this ahistoricity with Nietzsche's yeah, awareness of history, then we wonder then, yeah, why then in Shukyo to Naniga, or in Religion and Nothingness, Nishitani then seems to turn this evaluation around and yeah, praises Eckhart higher than Nietzsche. And so that is, I think you have your finger on an interesting issue then there. So what's going on there? But the point of connection then between Zen and Eckhart might again appear in Nishitani's later text on Buddhism, where another criticism that he levels against Buddhism is its ahistoricity, its lack of historical awareness. And so interestingly, on the one hand, there might be a positive connection that he tries to develop. This issue of history and the lack of history is going to be also this sort of critical connection, this maybe more negative connection or difficulty, both the mystical attitude as he understands it, as exemplified in Eckhart. And again, Buddhism, as he understands it in the Zen tradition, are lacking this issue of history. And I think that might also get us to that problem of singularity too at some point, right? This issue of temporality and how to approach the singular and what the issues are there too. But yeah, I think you're on the right track there. Definitely this tension there about how Nishitani sees something important in Eckhart, and yet that challenge of history and how to historicize, I guess, or bring historical consciousness into that mystical tradition, both for Zen and for the Christian mystical tradition.
Yeah, thanks so much for those references. I was also thinking a little bit about that. I mean, are the Buddhist texts on which he's drawing suffering the same kind of fates, that suffering the same kind of nihilism that it seems to me is necessary for actually passing through into this absolute nothingness, and then the death, sive, life, affirmation, negation. So I think that's really helpful to think about this critique of both Eckhart and Buddhism as lacking historicity. And my hunch with this is then to say that we're kind of using these figures as not necessarily as having the way, but as almost supplements. So the idea of saying like, well, Eckhart completely has it figured out, it doesn't quite make sense, but Eckhart can be a kind of guide. Nevertheless, there's an insufficiency there. We have to take up history seriously. We have to actually pass through nihilism. in a way that Eckhart was, constitutively incapable of, because he's not a modern. So I don't know. That might be one way to then think about how Eckhart's being used here, and like questions of fidelity then are maybe not as important if I think about a more strategic use of Eckhart in these texts for Nishitani's larger projects.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Sure.
Although speaking of, if I may add just one point in regard to this relation between mysticism and history and historical awareness, it's interesting at the same time to note that in this earlier text, also Eckart is portrayed as reacting to a historical crisis.
Right.
So even though it's of course not modern nihilism, but in parallelizing the crisis of modern post-Kantian nihilism and the rupture between faith and reason, and the post-Thomist situation of the High Middle Ages, wherein Nishitani seems to suggest Eckart and his mysticism emerged precisely because of in that sense, I would argue, a historical awareness for the situation of his time. So there I see a kind of maybe a tension to what was discussed just now.
Yeah, I see that as well, and I think it's a valid point, and it's an interesting reading. My question would be whether we can really see the sort of advent of modern nihilism as sufficiently sort of parallel to sufficiently overlapping with the collapse of natural law, the collapse of a kind of Aristotelian science in the Middle Ages, or whether there's not something much more significant going on, in the 19th century. But yes, you're right. He is seeing Eckhart as historically minded, although it's very interesting how little Eckhart really cares about history. So yeah, I think it's a complicated issue here.
Hey, no question. So,
is there a way you can move the camera so that I can see?
the problem is that I cannot see me no
Oh,
more.
okay. Oh, I see.
I think I need Felipe because we see what's on you, but he disappeared in the mirror. I don't know. Where are we? Oh, okay. Okay, now who is the person? Probably is Tobias. Okay. We can make so. I am such a now. So in order to try to think about the two theories, the maximalist, the minimalist, I would like to ask you where would you place Eckhart's Godhead in relation to Platonism or new Platonism?
Yeah.
So, for example, Nishitani says Eckart start as Aristotelian or Thomistic, but then became Platonist with Augustine, but at the end arrived to Plotinus or new Platonist. So, because for me, assume that Zetaimu, absolute nothing of Nishida, is somehow related to emptiness, to Ku of Nishitani. Of course, they are not the same, but give for granted that there is a relation. The problem is this absolute nothingness or emptiness relation to Godhead. So I ask you, because is Godhead related somehow to Platonism or new Platonism or not? This is the first point.
Mm-hmm.
Second, if yes, is related to nothingness in the sense of epikinas thesousias or anipotheton or the idea of good, or to Plotinus Tohen. Because if there is a relation, this would be for me very interesting, because it's well known that Nishida thought the absolute nothingness not in relation to Epeikinaktis to Thesusias, but in relation to Cora. So Cora, this I think is very important. So if the Godhead in Eckart has something to do with a third, Triton or Cora, like, then we can find probably some affinities with Zeta Mu or Q. But if it's in the line of Platonic or New Platonic way to the one, to Tohen, probably it's impossible. And the young Nietzsche probably was not aware, so he felt himself very related to Augustine. But after having met the concept of Cora and produced the concept of absolute nothingness, he repeatedly say, I have nothing to do with middle-aged Platonism. So it's important to, I think, to be aware of this distance that he felt. So I ask you, where can we place Eckart in this?
Yeah, very good. Yeah, great questions. So initially I was going to say, well, I would place the Godhead more in line with Tohen in Neoplatonism. And in fact, when I said earlier that this emphasis on life that Nishitani places in his 1938 text is distinctive. I mean, I was thinking of alternative ways of reading Eckart. One would be a more henological approach, situating the Godhead in the context of the Neoplatonic one, which is beyond being and intellect, and beyond life as well. Another approach would be a more intellectualist approach that focuses on thinking intelligere in Eckart, and there you can read him as a kind of precursor of German idealism. So there are different ways in which to read Eckart. So I would situate him in terms of the one. I think a lot hinges on how we're reading the one. And here there's a nice essay by Rainer Schurmann called The One, Substance or Function, in which he offers a more functionalist interpretation of the one that I think brings it a bit closer to something like Cora. So I mean, I think there are big interpretive questions in Eckart on this front, but I would not rule out the possibility of a chorological reading of the Godhead, even though I think it would be harder to do than a more epekena tes usias sort of Neoplatonic reading. But I don't think that one could just offer one simply speaking in Eckart. So that's my initial reply, but it's great, and thanks also for that context that I'll look more into.
There are other questions, so from the persons on Zoom or in the class.
Well, maybe Lucas, to come back to your intervention on the possibility of applying a Platonic viewpoint to the teachings of Eckart. It seems to me that Eckart is much more indebted to Greek patristic, a Greek orthodox way to interpret contemplation of God. And there's a mainstream interpretation in Greek, early Greek patristic that very early dismisses the concept of the possibility of the contemplation of God as an eidos, as a form. Why? Because at a certain point, the epistemology coming from origin must be dismissed. Why? Because the Trinitarian dogma is taking shape. And the Trinitarian dogma is something which is intrinsically antinomic. And so Christian reflection comes to the point when Christian reflection realizes that there's something intrinsically difficult in contemplating the Trinity. So, how does Christian patristic answer to this problem? By dismissing the primacy of vision. In the sense that, for example, in the tradition that we find in Cappadocian Fathers, but also Pseudo-Dionysius, Maximum the Confessor, we have to equip ourselves with an antinomic language to express contemplation of God. For example, in Pseudo-Dionysius mystical theology, the fact that we have to talk about the luminous cloud or the dark light, or for example, in Gregory of Nyssa, the fact that the pinnacle of the experience of mystical union with God is given by, not by view, but by other senses. For example, Gregory of Nyssa uses images and vocabulary taken from the song of the songs in order to express this concept of mystical union with God. So I think that Eckart is really indebted to this kind of tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, very interesting.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, we see, I mean, all over Eckhart's what I was referring to earlier as a kind of Blumenbergian explosive metaphor, right? Sort of dark light, you know, these expressions that can't be understood based on, as you're saying, the primacy of vision. You know, I'm thinking about another classic one that Eckhart likes is the sphere whose center is everywhere and periphery nowhere. These sort of images that kind of collapse intelligibility or even a kind of visualization, right? They can't be visualized.